that's spoken into time and space in a language that everybody will always understand, with images and concepts that transcend all time and culture. That's just impossible. So we have to understand both the value of the wrapping, the plastic, which keeps it fresh, without mistaking the two. And that requires the church to hear what the Spirit is saying, to unpack, right, to get to the meat, as it were. So this is the process. So then the question is, not only what is the text that I'm reading, but the real question becomes, who are we that reads it? Who am I that's reading it? What do I bring to the text? Not merely, what does the text bring to me? If we, for example, as we will, explore the Road to Emmaus story today, and I'll be asking you to discuss that with your Emmaus walk partner, you will notice in that very conversation, different things will come out for different people, because the person reading it is different. So we have to begin to grapple and to embrace and to celebrate the reciprocity, the realization that when we talk about the Bible as inspired, that cannot only mean in the past. This is a big question for biblical scholars. What do we mean to say that the Bible is inspired? Is it the words on the page that are inspired? Is it the events that gave rise to those words? Was it the authors of those texts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul? Were they inspired? What does that mean? But notice that everything I just rolled out for you, it's all inspiration as a past moment. What if we ask about inspiration in the present moment? Here we're at that reciprocity. What of those texts, what of those words overlaps in a sense, or encounters the lens through which I'm reading it? What gets filtered out? What gets highlighted and introduced? How does that... So is inspiration something then that happens now, not merely in the past, where the Spirit speaks? I discern what the Spirit, or we as a community discern what the Spirit is saying. I mean, think about it. What would it mean to say the Bible is inspired if nobody ever opened it again? It would be like putting gas in the car and never starting it. It would serve no purpose. So the inspiration happens when we open that book and we begin to dialogue. We trust that in Holy Writ, in the pages of Scripture, God draws near to us, and we reach out and embrace that divine presence and ask, hear what the Spirit is saying. But what if we took another step and asked, what does it mean to suggest that inspiration is a future moment? Not only the words, the writers, the events in the past, not only what happens when you and I open the text and find ourselves inspired to forgive, to be more gracious, to be more kind and merciful, etc. But what about inspiration as a future moment? The Spirit leading us to that dream of God that Christ called the kingdom. And that future desire for that kingdom becomes the inspiration for how we deal with issues of social justice, how we create a world that is more egalitarian, how we preserve and protect our environment, and so on, because all of these things are inconsistent with that projected dream of a relationship between God and creation, God and humanity, that is in harmony and at peace, and so on. Very often in our liturgies at St. Columba's in Inverness, before I give my sermon and after we hear all the scriptures, I sit for just a few minutes and ask, what is the Spirit saying? And just have everybody in the congregation who feels moved to say that word or phrase that speaks to them. And it's always beautiful to me to hear this kind of kaleidoscopic response about what of all these things we just heard is speaking to this one or that one, and how in some weeks it feels like many people are hearing the very same word and phrase. It tells you something about what the Spirit is saying. You should be paying attention to this. So we pay attention to the body in the contemplative reading. We ask the body to respond. We pay attention to what's happening in the heart, not merely what we think about the text. I want to, first of all, are there any questions about that before I move on to sort of, yeah, please go ahead.
The word that stood out for me in what you're saying is inspire, inspirit, to breathe in.
Right.
And to breathe in the spirit, in spirit.
That's right. And there is absolutely, I mean, etymologically, inspire and spirate and all that is all deeply connected. We see the same thing actually happening in the Greek word for spirit, which is pneuma. And this is where we get words like pneumonia from, right? Because it has to do with breathing. And pneuma means both spirit, but it also means breath in Greek. And so we see, even though we would normally think of pneumonia as a connection to the spirit, in fact, you can see the words are the same there. It's just that we don't pronounce the P in English, but you do in Greek.
It's so interesting what you're talking about, and I'm wondering if you distinguish between sort of cultural trappings of the day and an idea of divine inspiration or received wisdom. But the more you study, the scholars who have looked at the roots of Greek philosophy, all the other dying and resurrecting gods of the Middle East, the traditions of Judaism, I'm wondering how you don't reduce the whole thing to history and culture. Still admiring, the interesting and beautiful ideas, but how is it that you, I mean, and maybe this is the problem with mysticism generally, is the utter subjectivity of it. Why is there not, to just put the whole thing into a cultural context and look at how some of these very beautiful ideas in the text came out of the cultures of their time? Where's the divine inspiration, that mystical idea that there's some received truth there?
As opposed to just one more iteration of a cultural experience.
As opposed to just looking at the vast sweep of human history and being awed at all the different ways in which humans have, interacted with the physical world, the cosmic world, and just looking at each of them as independently worthy and interesting, but not necessarily divinely inspired.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So let me suggest a couple things, and it may not be totally satisfying because we could probably do 3 hours.
It's an enormous question.
It's a huge question. But listen, so there is a beautiful and fascinating and interesting phenomenon in which we can often see what we call deep structural themes as opposed to surface structure. So deep structure would be things like good versus evil, light versus dark, those sort of binary opposites, right? This struggle between good and evil. Those would be deep structures. Surface structures are the way in which those concepts or themes or ideas are brought out in a specific way through a particular story or narrative or time or culture. In fact, structural criticism demonstrates that every story you've ever read, every movie you've ever watched, every play you've ever seen is really the same story over and over and over again. It's the same exact deep structure, it's just the surface structure changes. And that deep structure essentially says there is a hero or heroine, we call them the subject, who has to accomplish something, an object. Somebody or someone will benefit from that. Somebody or something sent them to do that. Revenge, justice, love, mercy, or could be somebody like, remember what was it, Hawaii 5-0, if you agree to accept this, right? It all has this somebody, there's a sender. There's those who are opposed to the subject achieving this, and then there's of course friends who are assisting in the process. Now this could be everything from the story of Exodus, where you have Moses trying to free Israel, and God is sending him, and Pharaoh is opposed to him, and his friends are Aaron and Miriam. I mean, it's the whole thing. So what's the goal? To liberate, to Jesus, sent by God to save the world, apostles, against Pontius Pilate. It's the same story. Or you could take, Les Miserables, or go on and on. It's all the same story. Now, so in a sense, to understand in these various cultural ways that there are these deep iterations of these, if you want to say, universal truths, the question then becomes, what makes this particular surface structure, this cultural iteration, more valuable than any other? I am an avid reader of J.R.R. Tolkien's works, particularly his most famous so-called trilogy. It was never a trilogy, everybody just thinks it was. Lord of the Rings, and his precursor to that, which is the Silmarillion. And J.R.R. Tolkien has been profoundly I think, misunderstood by modern culture as just one more fantasy novel writer. But to understand his works is to understand his deep theological base. He was a Roman Catholic, deeply committed so. And underlying his entire mythical world of Middle-earth is the gracious action of God, essentially, in the world. He plays into this in multiple ways. There's many commentaries connecting that and demonstrating that with great clarity. One of the things he says outside of his works in various letters or other academic publications that he talks about is what he calls, in Christianity, the myth that is true, which is fascinating to me. And what he means by that is when you look at all of these other religious traditions around the hopefulness of salvation, the idea of unity with God, and so on, he says every one of those elements is present and brought to fruition in Christianity. Now, he's speaking subjectively as a Christian. But as I read his works and understand that deeper structure, I'm sympathetic to that idea. That's something within the Christian message. There is, for example, one of these near universal ideas is called the hero's journey. How are you familiar with the hero's journey? It's a basic element. So it simply would say there is some. Can you all see that in the back? That says union. Okay. There is some ultimate or primeval union between humanity and the gods, whatever you want to call it. And then something fractures and goes wrong, that there's some war in the heavens or some split or divide or betrayal. And so then humanity starts going in search of that reunification. And we go on, or we have a particular individual go on the so-called hero's journey, in which they step out of their comfort zone, they go on this great epic journey, encountering all kinds of enemies, whether those are dragons or angels or whatever, and they're fighting. And then they come back to the community and they bring the so-called boon. They bring the riches, the treasure, the insight and knowledge of union, and they become our spiritual masters, our gurus, our healers, those who can bring us to that deep sense of union we're all longing for. And what Tolkien says is, in Christ, that has been done to perfection. This is his point, right? Now, but there's a difference in the way that Christianity understands this hero's journey. Because essentially, a Christian in search of God is an oxymoron. The idea is that we don't ever make it home to that union. We never reach enlightenment because God does it for us. This is incarnation. Instead of us having to make our way, so what is it? What is this union, of course, in our own Christian mythology is rendered in the story of Eden, the Edenic myth, as we call it, the myth of Adam and Eve, right? Who then fall into the illusion of separation by trying to be God apart from God. See, this is the fatal flaw of humanity. We had total union with God. Walking in the cool of the evening breeze with God is this primitive way of saying we are one with the divine in intimate relationship. What Catherine Mowry LaCunha calls in her book on the Trinity, God for us, what is the word? She calls it, we are theonomous, in other words, grounded and rooted in God, as opposed to autonomous, this illusion that we are separate from one another, from God. And the forbidden fruit, as it were, becomes the symbol of that grasping. But we were grasping for something that we already possess, union with the divine. But the serpent, you see, and this is how evil works, doesn't it? It doesn't just lie, it tells a half-truth. Did God really tell you you couldn't eat all these trees in the garden? No, that's not what he said. He said, this one. Oh, that one. Do you know why? Not supposed to. Because then you'll be just like him. You'll know good from evil. You don't need God. You'll have it all. See? So they do. And then God, notice, in the walking in the cool of the garden, evening. Adam and Eve, where are you? This is new. Finally, after searching for them, we might suggest almost desperately, if you'll give me a little creative license there. What are you doing behind the bush? Well, we ate this fruit and we knew that we were naked. We were ashamed. This is the breach. Who told you that you were naked? Is the question. To what terrible lie did you succumb to think that you couldn't be naked before me who knows you better than yourself? What a terrible thing have we done? What they've done, what we've done, is we've fallen into that illusion of separation we call the exile. And in our exile, Israel is forever longing. How long, O Lord? How long? When will you liberate us? And the Psalms and the prophets are crying out for centuries. For centuries. When? How long? Will you cast your eyes away from all the children of Adam? So we begin our long journey with the prophets, crying out to God, but then something very different happens in the Christian understanding of the hero's journey. And it's best told in the Christian version of the story of Adam and Eve, which is the story of the prodigal son. Talk about deep structure, surface structure, it's the same story, just different characters. And the Son, but now told through the lens of the Incarnation. This is why Tolkien would say it completes it. Because it's the myth in which we never make it home. God, as that Father, rushes out to greet us while we're still on the way. Eden ends in exile. The prodigal son ends with the Father rushing out. He's waiting and waiting. The son, in the story, the son is out there. He basically says to his father, "You're as good as dead to me. Give me half your inheritance. I mean, your money's worth more to me than this relationship." Talk about squandering an intimate relationship with the divine. But in his own graciousness and humility, the Father gives it to him. To his own destruction. He blows it all, wine, women, and salt. And then a great famine hits the land. Now, the early church fathers would say that famine is a symbol of the famine of his own heart. He's desiring this intimacy with his Father. And then this beautiful text, which is rare. We rarely hear in Scripture about the inner life of any of the characters. Many times they're just almost sort of like props. You don't really get into what's moving them. But it says in this beautiful phrase, it's often translated, and then he came to his senses. But what it really says in Greek is he came to himself. He came home to himself. And realized, I've got a plan. I'm going to prepare my rehearsed speech. Dad, I'm not worthy to be your son anymore after what I've done, but anything's better than eating out of pig troughs. So take me in as your servant. I'll be a good servant. I'll be obedient. And he starts making his way home. The Father, as soon as he sees him, rushes out, wraps his arm around his shoulders, around his neck, kisses him on his neck, all but collapsing in joy. He doesn't even give his son a chance to apologize. He's not interested. The best shoes, the finest robe, brightest ring. An often missed detail of the story of Eden is that as Adam and Eve enter into exile, God very mercifully sews loincloths. He dresses them to cover their shame, and here the father is dressing his son as one who is dignified, whose dignity as heir to his father has been restored. When the older son hears about it, we all know how that went. Runs out of the house in a fit, and what is the father doing?